Okay, we're recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College. I'm joined by Ley Cray, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Texas Christian University, and David Friedell, who's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Union College. So thanks again for joining me. I want to start where we left off last time and not let David off the hook. In terms of the question of when can someone's intention to produce a story about a character fail, right? And so what would it take for someone to produce, someone intend to produce a story about Batman, but their story features a character who's not Batman, right? Is numerically distinct from the Batman, right? About whom other stories exist. And so what would have to be the case for someone to fail at creating a story about Batman or using the character of Batman and instead accidentally creating this new character?
Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks for having us. I should have said something more when you asked, but I can say a little bit now. At least on my view, I think it's pretty hard to fail. In other words, I think if you try to tell a story about Batman, in almost all, maybe all cases, you're going to succeed. At least I think it's just as easy to tell a story about Batman as it is to tell a story about Elizabeth Warren. And I think that's very easy. So I think in a lot of ways I'm just following maybe like Saul Kripke's picture of reference, where as long as you're standing like in the right causal chain or the right causal relationship to other people who are talking about Elizabeth Warren, you'll be able to talk about Elizabeth Warren. And likewise, you'll be able to talk about Batman. You know, even if you're like me, you don't know nearly as much about the Batman comics as Lee does, it'll be pretty easy for me to piggyback off of this linguistic practice about talking about Batman, even if I get lots of the canonical properties about Batman wrong. So, I mean, one upshot of this view that might be surprising for some is that, you know, if you were on a different planet and you wrote a story that looks an awful lot like it's a story about Batman, you know, it has all the canonical properties, but you're just completely removed from this practice about talking about Batman, then I think it's not a Batman story because you're not causally connected in the right way. Likewise, I think, you know, people in a different galaxy can't have thoughts about Elizabeth Warren, even if it looks like they might be. They're just not causally connected in the right way. So yeah, no matter how like far your story strays from the canon, if you're making a good faith effort to refer to Batman, you know, if really, as long as you're just intending to refer to Batman, then I think you succeed.
Okay, Lee, do you want to respond to that?
So I think, David, perhaps at the heart of our disagreement is you're using this linguistic machinery of reference, and you seem to be approaching fiction making as referring to characters by way of ascribing properties to them. And that's not how I look at fiction making. So I think of fictions as artifacts that are built and constructed, and they're built using tools. And I think of fictional characters as one of the tools in that fiction making toolbox. And I don't think when we use a fictional character, we're just referring to it. I think we're manipulating it and employing it and using it. And I think that's it's a scale and it's a rule governed activity. So what I would say is, over time, as characters become more solidified in like a public consciousness, whether, you know, on a small scale with a very devout fandom or large scale, there are certain moves that sort of calcify as legitimate or illegitimate usages of the character, right? And I think when you pile on the illegitimate usage of moves, there's a breaking point at which point someone, fully informed ideal reader is going to say, yeah, no, misuse of the tool. You just didn't, not even like, you just failed. You reached in the toolbox to grab a hammer and you grabbed a screwdriver. so I think we can think of internal properties as like ordered, maybe like in a web, where there are the ones on the periphery that the fan base could be like, yeah, we can give those up.
Mhm.
Right. But then when you move more toward the core, there are the inviolable ones where, like, if a character doesn't have that property, and this is not to say all characters have properties like this, but some probably do, where, like, if you tell a story about that character without those hardcore internal properties, the fan base, if they didn't know your intention, are going to look at it and be like, yeah, that's not a story about that character. And I think that reaction is a evidence of failure. So I was mentioning to Brandon in between our little recording sessions here about Zack Snyder's Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice. Now, what I'm about to say is probably false, like, but I like the view. You might think that in that movie, Superman is angsty and whiny and not this symbol of indomitable hope, which over time I think is calcified as one of the hardcore properties of the Superman character. And Batman in that movie, who's not even called Batman throughout the movie, he's called the Bat of Gotham, right? But he marks people for death and gets people killed, right? Directly, and not just like leaving them to die or something. Like he knows what he's doing, and he's essentially killing people. But I think not killing people is calcified as a property, as essential property of Batman. So again, I think this is a very strong claim, but I think it's an interesting claim. You might think that on Zack Snyder's Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice, it's a movie that features a character that looks like Batman, called the Bat of Gotham, and a character that looks like Superman, called Superman, but it doesn't have either Batman or Superman in it.
Lee, so going back to your metaphor of using tools, right, and sort of reaching into the toolbox, intending to get a hammer and getting a screwdriver,
Yeah.
right? That's sort of how you're describing this case. But an alternative way to describe it might be that you're reaching into the toolbox, you're getting the hammer you intend to, but then you're misusing it, right? You've sort of, you think you need a hammer, what you really need is a screwdriver, and so you're trying to pound the screw into the wall when really you need a screwdriver to get that screw in there, right? So yeah, go ahead.
So I think here's what I would say to that. For a character to appear in a fiction, there must be at least minimally successful usage of that character as storytelling tool in the building of that fiction. So you reach into the character, or into the fiction toolbox, you pull out your Batman tool, and you mess it up so bad that even if you were using the Batman tool, you didn't succeed in using the Batman tool to insert Batman into your fiction. Right. So I don't think it's just like a fiction has the characters that are used as tools to build the fiction. I think the fiction has as characters, characters that are used as tools successfully in the building of the fiction.
Okay, so there's a success condition there.
Yeah.
And so what Zack Snyder's done in Batman v Superman, or whatever it's called, yeah, that's a movie that I started on an airplane and gave up on shortly into it. But what he's doing is he's so failed that what he's done is he's produced two characters that are distinct from Batman and Superman, even if they share a lot of canonical character traits with them.
Yeah, I don't think my view entails that he failed, but I think it's a fun test case. And if you really want to pick on Zack Snyder, this is a fun application of the view. Right. I think it's probably not the case that he was that incompetent, because I think most people would look at the film and be like, yeah, it's Batman and Superman, right? Most informed fans. So this is just my hot take on the film to demonstrate what kind of blood this view can draw. Because that's really what we're all about, right? Philosophical violence.
I'm gonna be repeating my view, but one thing I want to say is I do think my view can explain what's going on in these sorts of cases. So like, I was really disappointed with as many fans were with the last few seasons of Game of Thrones. I thought Tyrion, who was built up to be this like super intelligent character, suddenly was making a lot of foolish mistakes. And you'd have to make a really charitable interpretation to explain that. It just seemed like he suddenly got less smart. Arya, they built her up to be this like super cool assassin, except for one big exception in the last season. It's like she didn't use any of her cool training. So I was really disappointed about this. But I mean, so if you want to push Lee's view, it could be like, oh, it's no longer about Tyrion. It's no longer about Arya. It's about like some imposter character. But I would say what's upsetting about that is no, we're still talking about Tyrion and we're still talking about Arya, and the author is in referring to these characters or like inviting us to pretend things about these characters that we don't want to pretend about them. That maybe they don't obey the rules, right? To use the kind of concept that Lee was employing. I do think though that there are some cases that maybe support Lee's intuition, or at least put some pressure to how I want to think about this. If we think about not fictional characters, but like musical works, like I do find it attractive that you could, be so bad at playing a particular piece that you don't count as playing it.
Yeah, I made a whole musical career out of that.
So I'm very sympathetic to that view. I think one reason why that might be different is because I really think when we're thinking and when we're engaging with fiction, we really are just referring to characters. And I think reference is very easy. But I think in order to count as performing a work, it's maybe not as easy as referring. It's a different kind of activity that's more rule bound. But I think that is a sort of case that might support Lee's view.
So I think with the Tyrion case, I think basically he's included by courtesy in the later seasons. Like the fact that that character is Tyrion is guaranteed by the fact that like it's a continuous story. It was Tyrion, and then they just started misusing him. But like once he's in, he's not back out through misuse. Whereas what's interesting about the Zack Snyder film is that was like it was the first appearance of the Batman character in that particular compartmentalized story.
I see.
So I think the case might be a little different.
No, that's fair. No, that's an important distinction.
Yeah. But at the same time, like you could generate a very similar hypothetical case where you just imagine that before Zack Snyder had released Batman versus Superman, he had released Bat of Gotham, where he got the Batman character right and then completely flubbed it up in the next one. I think there I'd be committed to saying that the Bat of Gotham in Batman versus Superman is Batman, definitely in that case. Yeah.
Gotcha. So David, in your view, basically someone can't accidentally create a fictional character, right? In the sense that, well, no, that's not true.
There's some weird cases, but
Yeah.
for the most part, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so let's divert this just a bit. I mean, it relates to what we're saying, what we're talking about, to fan fiction and the relationship between characters as they appear in fan fiction versus as they appear in sort of the canonical source material. And so when Batman appears in my Batman fan fiction, or when Sherlock Holmes appears in a story I've created, right? Is it really Sherlock Holmes in my story? Is it really Batman in my story? Or is it, a character that's similar to Sherlock Holmes or Batman in a lot of respects, but ultimately it's a numerically distinct individual from either of those two?
Since you can probably guess what my answer is, I'll just say it is a story about Batman. Now there's a question about whether it becomes canon, and that might depend in part on how good your story is, but really I think that's a socially determined fact about like what do the fans accept as canon. But I think when we're deciding whether a work of fan fiction is going to be part of the canon or we're deciding that it's not, what we're kind of building up these normative practices, and we're saying when we're going to pretend things collectively about Batman, these are the sorts of things we're going to be pretending, and maybe the things in your story won't be part of that collective pretending. But that's a separate question from whether when we're reading your story, we're being invited to pretend something about Batman, and I would say you can succeed pretty easily at that.
Yeah, I think I'm with David on that. We're back to agreeing. I think in typical cases, fan fiction about sort of established characters is really fiction about those characters, not canonical. But I think it's important that it be about those characters. And I think fan fiction plays very important roles, socially and politically, because like a lot of fan fiction communities use stories about their beloved characters as a way to introduce and explore further diverse representation in the stories. And I think in some cases, like this is really good. So, for example, to take a sort of controversial topic these days, the Harry Potter universe, the wizarding world of J.K. Rowling. So J.K. Rowling has revealed herself as having a social political ideology that is antithetical to my dignity. And like personally, not directed to me personally, but it has personal implications. So I welcome Harry Potter fan fiction. I welcome a reclamation of those characters and not proxies of those characters, not copycats, but like Harry and Hermione and Ron too, I guess. A way of like saturating the fictional landscape with new stories about those characters as an attempt to do the impossible, which is drown out J.K. Rowling. It's impossible, but I still think it's worth doing. So I think there's this interesting sort of social, political, and moral component to fan fiction that is best explained if we think that they're the same character.
Yeah, that's a great case. I mean, awful what's happened, but philosophically a great case. I mean, it's very difficult. I do want to just, I don't think it's metaphysically impossible. And I think you're right. I think it's something we should be striving for as fans to like reclaim works in these sorts of cases. Again, to allude back to music, this happens in lots of musical genres, of folk music or jazz, right? The originator of a song doesn't always get to decide how we're going to sing the song or play the song. So yeah, I think it would be great if fans revolted in this case. I also think it would be great if we all revolted and decided that the last season of Game of Thrones isn't canon, or I would go back as far as the end of season 5, basically when they ran out of the books. That if we could all just collectively decide that that if HBO wants to start again from from season 6, like I think that would be great. And we don't treat we could decide as fans not to treat those other seasons as canon. Yeah.
So Disney, so Disney could like reboot the Star Wars sequels, right? Like, let's just say those don't exist, and then let's reboot it.
Yeah, I mean, Disney is so powerful that the fans
they can do anything.
that the fans would probably go along. But I think Lee and I are in agreement that there really is this social component where it's not that J.K. Rowling succeeds because of like it's a metaphysical necessity. There's a social practice where we defer to the author in these cases, but we don't have to, and we don't always do.
Yeah. I think with the Star Wars case, Disney won't reboot. And I want to be clear, my objections, there are a lot of different species of objection to the sequel trilogy. Some of the objections I think are deeply problematic. Like, people don't like it because it's Rey and Finn and their inclusion is political and it has an agenda. I think that's a bad reason to dislike the sequel trilogy. It has no more of an agenda than George Lucas had when he first wrote Star Wars, which was a deeply political movie. My problem is with the storytelling. I like 7, 8 was cool. 9 retroactively ruined 8 and 7 by making them worse films. So for me, my headcanon, what I consider to be the Star Wars universe is A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy, the Knights of the Old Republic games, the Shadows of the Empire novel, and what else? And the Mandalorian show, right? So what I've done there is I'm basically saying, look, I recognize that there is this public social Star Wars system. I'm not a fan of that. I'm a fan of this selective subset that I have aesthetically curated in my own head, and that's my headcanon. Yeah.
There's a fun analogy here with Magic the Gathering. There's some fans who think the way it was played in 1994, I think, was the best. So they just only play with the cards that were made up until 1994, and they acknowledge that there's this other practice.
Yeah.
Awesome, cool. So I think on the power of individuals and the powers of fandoms, I think that's a perfect place to end. So thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both of you.